Hello and welcome back to Painting with Andrew Theophilopoulos. Today we're painting in the sketchbook with oil. So I got a few brushes. I like to use Rosemary, Langnickel, and Vinci. There's a Windsor Newton brush in there. And basically these are just soft, bristle, either hog hair or mongoose hair. We've got student grade and professional grade Windsor Newton with a small Gamblin. Several years ago, while I was working very hard doing freelance, schoolwork, thesis, and lots of drawing, I heavily injured the nerves in my arms. I had a pretty severe surgery to try and fix the drawing problem that I was having. And while I was recovering, I learned how to draw with two hands. So the sketch we're working on today actually came from one of those two-hand sketches. I brought it into Photoshop, slapped it together with a painting of my palette in the landscape, just to give it a little bit of texture, some cross lines. Throw on top an old painting of mine to give the influence of color maybe, a little bit of lighting. You can see the effects there. And just a small touch-up to show myself where I might be going. So typically when I paint in sketchbooks, I use a moleskin. This is actually, I don't know what brand this is, but this is a cheaper, smaller moleskin that I'll be painting on the cover. It's a cardboard cover with just paper. Kind of fell apart as I was painting through it, but here you can see I'm going to gesso that board. I use I think professional quality Liquitex. I would say stay away from the student quality, it's very bad. Today I'll be painting on a gesso paper, but here's a few samples from an old sketchbook of mine, a moleskin, where I paint directly on the paper. It's kind of like watercolor, it's a little dry, it doesn't flow around as much. I would say it's an enjoyable experience, but probably for a better quality painting you'd want to gesso it. So look at my palette here. I've got cools that go all the way over to the brown, starting with white, blues, greens, etc. And I've got a little bit of Gamsol. You can see it was just a watery wash of color at first. The second medium that I'm using is going to be a linseed oil. But both of these mediums are used to bring more fluidity to the oil paint. So Gamsol is actually meant to dissolve the paint. That's how you clean your brushes. But it can act like water. You can push the paint around and almost do like a watercolor effect. With the linseed oil, it almost brings more pigment or more paint into each stroke. So it's kind of meant to not only bring fluidity into it, but extend the paint and make it easier to maneuver around as you move forward. I really enjoy using the linseed oil just because it'll last all day. I can keep the painting wet and wiggle it around over and over for several hours, and it just keeps the entire painting nice and fluid. Gamsol, I would say, is something you use for the very beginning. Something to do a wash. You definitely don't want to use thin Gamsol layers later on in the painting. So as soon as you're done with your Gamsol wash, it's on to the thick paint. I believe they call that thick over thin. So I did a little bit of designing in Adobe Photoshop, as you saw earlier, but for the most part I'm making this up as I go. I would say it's definitely a little difficult, not only to be recording, doing this in oil, but most of my design is going to come later on as I try and put texture and effects through it. I would say this is a mediocre design right now. I'm kind of just doodling. I use a lot of Photoshop tricks when I'm working on the computer just to get me out of any situations where I may be stuck. I could bring in textures or influential lighting, this and that. But today, while I'm in the oil, I'm going to use a little technique that I like to call scrapage. So it's pretty nice. There's a lot of paint being scraped away. Brought out a lot of details just because of my gesso job. There's a lot of texture, a little bit of streaks and scraping. So I use that, actually. I bring it into Photoshop and try and see new imaginary lines, new design, clean up the palette, and start going into it. So a minute ago I actually did a little scribble on the wrist there. It was, I think, a few swipes of my finger, maybe the back of the brush, and that's actually going to come in handy a little bit later when I go down to paint the wristband. So going into Photoshop, I think something I'd probably do halfway through any oil painting just to fix it up, maybe make some adjustments and ensure that I'm going the right way. I don't think I was going to have a good painting before I scraped it all off. And it's something I've done for a long time. Going into figure painting classes, we do paintings all the time. Usually they're bad. You don't want to waste your panel, so you scrape it off at the end of the day. At least you got the practice. So when I'm stuck, sometimes I'll scrape it off because I know beginning again could bring new life into a painting. So actually I've got my iPad right next to me. I've got the JPEG of that little paint over I did in Photoshop. And from this point on, I basically know where I'm going. I'm just going to be copying, stroke for stroke, the image on my iPad. There's a lot of chiseling that needs to be done. Basically just bringing in the background and going at the silhouette, just to reinforce what I really want it to be. One thing that's going to be really nice right here, adding this red onto a lot of the color that's already going on. Instantly you saw how things mix together. It's a good way to get the mid-tone of, let's say, two colors together. So there was the background, which was that kind of gray. I could bring in the red, and instead of being that super saturated red, it dulled it down into the gray. The more red that I add, it would leave the gray side and start going more towards the color of the pants that I wanted. So there's lots of detailing that's going on here, and I'm actually using a nice calligraphy brush. It's this super tight, I think squared off sable brush. It's a Langnickel, I believe, or Rosemary, and it's what I'm going to be using for most of the detail work. You can see I'm putting in new color, adding the greens, just a slight variation over to the orange or slight variation to the blue, depending on if it's in the shadow or in the light. And since I've got so much of that linseed oil built up, I'm actually able to just wiggle around and let the colors mix together. So things are coming along pretty nice. I'll add in a little bit of light, a little bit of dark, just to get the form to turn, or perhaps to bring the cloth up above the pants and cast a shadow to it. A lot of times the values would be the same. Let's say the color of the red pants is almost the same value as the color of his green hand. And that's one of those instances where I'll recognize that, probably go in 3 or 4 times with a darker red just to make sure the silhouette of the hand reads. So at this point, it's a lot of detailing. I'm trying to fix design still over and over with that little piece there, but it's something that just needs to be worked until you get it, until you hit the right note. Something in Photoshop, it's great. You can just undo over and over. And with oil, it's kind of the same thing. Usually there's a little bit too much paint buildup where it's hard to put in new strokes or new designs just because a lot of the old paint will pick up and add into your mixtures. So yeah, it's definitely quite a bit of toggling back and forth, and sometimes I'd have to scrape out color just because it has too much influence, even though it's paint that I put down at least an hour ago. So just drawing with the brush is probably one of my favorite things to do, letting the colors interact. I picked up that, I believe it was a red again for the feathers there, the tail feathers, and letting the colors mix just really does some really nice and weird things. I popped in a little more of that red just to bring out the light. You may have noticed just a few dabs here and there. Really brought the shadow onto the pants like I was explaining a minute ago. So many times I'm going back and forth on these. A lot of people might enjoy their first stroke. Sometimes the first stroke is the best. But I find that the more I go into these paintings, the more times I hit a space or an area, the more history it has, the more texture it has, and just the more rendered it actually kind of looks. So here we got a zoom in, a close-up of that little scribble that I did with my finger, and I was so happy that it actually looked like something. I ended up turning it into a little flower, some leaves here and there, some sort of tribal wristband I thought would be really nice. So that was one of the interesting things where just a small scribble, an accident, turned out to be pretty good for my situation. I think I was a little irritated at the time, which if you were to go back to the video of me doing it, it's just a quick flick. But it has the energy of perhaps life, perhaps flowers, kind of have that essence to them. So yeah, just chiseling away. This little sash thing is giving me a lot of trouble. But I think I'm finally getting the gravity to fit right and to hang around his waist in a good way. But yeah, just bringing in some of the influence. I had that purple flower. It really wasn't in many places over the painting, but it doesn't hurt to, let's say, give the green sash a purple reflective light, or bring that purple up into his head feathers. But yeah, so I think I touched the eye a million times and needed to soften it, which I'll do right here, just to get rid of some of the hard edges, because I went over it so many times. And with that, one last dot, and we're done. An invisible signature. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. A nice little sketchbook painting. I hope there's enough information in this video for you to try it out yourself. Be sure to subscribe and check out some of my earlier videos. Thanks for watching, everybody. See you.